All right, so Dr. Lisa, I'm going to jump right in. You are incredible with people with relationships, navigating all the different complexities that come with it. I want to talk about divorce. I want to ask you a couple things about that.
Mm.
The divorce rate is pretty high. I know some people report it to be as high as 50%. I've always wondered how accurate that number is. Maybe you can comment on that. But why is divorce so rampant in our culture today?
Well, I think there are honestly a lot of variables. And what's interesting for me about that research is that if you look at different subsets of the population, the divorce rates are actually quite different. So, for example, people who get married a little bit later in life, late 20s, early 30s, rather than being 19 or 20, the divorce rates are actually much lower. Divorce rates are also correlated with the level of education you have, socioeconomic status, and other kinds of risk factors. So I think the story is really in the data of what are people who have low divorce rates doing that really helps them have stronger, healthier, more sustainable marriages.
But yeah, I think that's really interesting because, my parents were both born and raised in India
Mhm.
where arranged marriages are the norm and the divorce rate's super low. So that was always the messaging was let your parents pick your partner. They know you better than yourself, et cetera, et cetera. But there's some really strong cultural
Yeah.
paradigms around divorce. Like it's so frowned upon and there's so much shame with it. And so it doesn't paint a perfect picture. But at the same time, I love looking at it and saying, yeah, what are they doing that makes the divorce rate so low? So can you expand a little bit more? What is common in these couples where the divorce rate is lower? You mentioned education. It sounds like higher socioeconomic status, getting married a little bit later. What are some other factors?
Those are great questions. And so, yeah, so broadly, when you look at the data, that's what you can see. But honestly, in my experience as a marriage counselor, what I see the strongest correlation being are a couple of things. People who have a proactive approach towards life in general tend to recognize that there are problems brewing sooner rather than later. And they're also motivated to do something about that. The same kinds of people who might be saving for retirement or taking care of their health, they're maintaining relationships in the same kind of way. So that's a huge, huge thing. Yeah, versus people who are like, oh, it's not that bad, or marriage counseling is expensive, or I don't want to open that box. They kind of procrastinate. Then by the time they connect with somebody like me, sometimes it can really be too late. So that's one piece. But another that's really important, I think, is a personality factor that's organized around taking responsibility and accountability for how you're showing up in the relationship and how you might be impacting your partner for better or for worse. I think a lot of times it's easy for all of us, and I am a married person, vulnerable to this as well. But we can look outward at our partner and what they're doing or not doing, but it's so much harder to turn that gaze back to ourselves. So,
Yeah,
but those two things are
it,
really significant.
it makes a lot of sense, and
Hmm.
it's definitely like it makes sense when you kind of get into the depths of it that there's a
Yeah.
lot more going on.
Yep.
When someone comes to you, we have a lot of listeners whose marriages have been strained because of a pornography
Yeah.
addiction, or sometimes it's even just what you were alluding to, where they're just not really maintaining the relationship. A lot of
Mm.
guys, in particular, I think, are quite guilty of just coasting, and then they get the wake up call. They either get caught with the addiction, or the wife is just sick and tired of the same dynamics. Is it too late? By the time you've reached that point where the wife is threatening to leave or whatever, is it too late, or what should a guy be doing if his marriage is on the line?
That I'm so glad you're talking about this. I actually recorded an episode of my podcast, Love, Happiness, Success, all about this, how to stop a divorce in this like crisis moment. And it is so important to handle this very intentionally because it is quite fragile. And the way you handle this, like moment of truth, will oftentimes define the trajectory of, not to sound overly dramatic, but like the trajectory of your life, of your marriage, of your family. So when people are like, I don't want to do this anymore, I want a divorce, it can happen in a couple of different ways. Option one is actually the better way. If somebody gets really angry and flooded and frustrated and it comes out of their mouth and they're like, I don't want to do this anymore, I want a divorce, in the heat of the moment, that's fantastic because they've just been authentic. They've said the things that they're really feeling, and you have time to take this seriously and mobilize yourself to fix it. And we can talk about what that looks like. There is also, though, unfortunately, the thing that I think is harder to deal with, which is what I think of as the sleeper. And that is where one person has been thinking about getting divorced for a long time, often years. Sometimes they're coming and talking to somebody like me in therapy or coaching about, what do I do with this relationship? You know, they're in the space of ambivalence, of indecision. But for whatever reason, they're not able to fix things with their partner. And so over a period of time, they really lose hope in the relationship. And over that time, their attachment to their partner actually sort of disintegrates, so that by the time they say out loud, I am ready to end this relationship, they have achieved closure. There's a lot of resolve. They don't have the same attachment to the relationship anymore. And so when people come into marriage counseling at that point, you know, the partner who has already released that attachment will say things like, I want to care and I want to try, and I just don't. So the other person has just been blindsided and they're like all, you know, hyper to fix it, but there is nothing to mend on the part of the other person. And that's really hard. And that's hard.
So we'll definitely talk
Yeah.
about how to prevent things from getting there in the first place. But
Right.
I do want to double down on
Mm-hmm.
this because I think
Yeah.
these are real situations. They happen a lot, and it
Yeah.
sounds like it's the silent but deadly spouse. Like that's the one you have to look out for.
Right.
Maybe you can feel the disconnection, but they're not saying anything.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually like that's a good warning sign. Hey, you better get in there before
Yeah.
he or she detaches, and it's too late.
Yeah. That when the fighting stops without a real good reason for the fighting to have stopped
Ooh,
is a very serious warning sign that it's coming
okay.
down the pipeline. Yeah.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting to think about?
Very interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
kind of counterintuitive. So somebody comes to your office. Let's say it's that situation, but now it's
Yeah.
too late. So the divorce is happening or has happened.
Right.
What are best practices other than seeing somebody like yourself who's going to be able to guide them wisely through that experience? What are things that you see people do when they're freshly divorced that makes things worse or sets them up poorly versus things they can do that will set them up for success as they move forward in life?
Right. Well, and actually, just to back up a bit, yes, I think it's very important for people to have support, like somebody in their corner when they're going through this very difficult and often traumatic life experience. But not all therapists are the same. And in my experience of working with a lot of therapists, actually, most therapists do not really understand how to help people through these kinds of life transitions. Therapists are trained to diagnose and treat mental health conditions, psychiatric disorders. Somebody going through a divorce is not necessarily experiencing that. So your best bet would be to connect with probably a marriage and family therapist, or really look for somebody who has even a therapist with a coaching background that can help people get through that, so especially if they have experience in breakup and divorce. Because what will happen otherwise is that you might land in a therapist's office and they're like, oh, you're depressed or you have attachment issues that, you know, and I don't know, maybe you do, but maybe you don't, because this therapist is holding a hammer. So you look like a nail because that's what they know how to do. And that is not helpful. So
I'm
just
so
to
glad you
be
said that.
thinking about that. Yeah.
Yeah, because even in our practice, we find like we've had a lot of clients who have done years with a therapist, and then
Yeah.
they come to us to get coaching. And
Right.
in a session or two, they're just saying, "Wow, this is way more valuable than what I got before." Not because
Right.
those therapists are bad people, there was
Right.
no malice, but they just, you're right, like they weren't equipped. They had a certain lens they were looking
Yeah.
at things through, and that person, ended up not making the greatest use of their time or money. So I'm glad you said
Right.
that. Find
Yeah.
somebody who, I guess, specializes in this area and
Yes.
can
Mm-hmm.
coach, right? Is not
Yes.
just a
Yes.
therapist, but can coach.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, really good. What are some other things that people should be doing They're recently divorced. What can they do to set themselves up for success?
Oh my goodness, such a great question. So, in my experience, this process is really one of growth and healing that happens in stages. And if people don't recognize what stage of this process they're in or have a good roadmap on how to manage it, it can create a lot of problems for them. So, for example, the first stage of this process, particularly for somebody who wasn't expecting a divorce or who didn't want the relationship to end, is characterized by this big withdrawal, the severing of an attachment bond that has an incredibly powerful impact on us mentally, emotionally, physiologically. They're often ruminating about their ex or experiencing a lot of fear, anxiety, overwhelm, I mean, even panic that's actually biologically rooted, believe it or not, which I didn't know this either. So, as a therapist, as a conventionally trained therapist, when I was just starting out, I was in this situation with clients frequently who were going through this, and what I had learned how to do in counseling school did not speak to this, and so I wasn't getting great results with clients, and they felt stuck, and I felt stuck, and so I actually had to go into research into other fields, so including psychology, but actually biology, specifically the work of Dr. Helen Fisher, who I am her biggest fan. But she was able to identify the fact that people who are going through breakups, heartbreak, severed attachment bonds, their brains are working very, very differently. So it's really in alignment with what a withdrawal experience from an addictive substance does to us mentally, emotionally, and physically. So you have a tendency towards compulsive behaviors like reaching out to the ex or doing impulsive things or really working hard to reconnect in unhealthy ways. Sometimes stalking behaviors can come out of this. Desperate behaviors can come out of this. And so, particularly for people in the beginning stages, what I always advise is don't believe everything you think, don't believe everything you feel, and do not act on whatever your brain is telling you need to be doing right now. Just like slow it all down and realize that you're going through something major, not just mentally, not just emotionally, but physiologically. Like we are wired to bond to other people. And when those bonds are broken, it's like this that makes us not really making great decisions for a while, especially, sorry, I'm just like, I could talk about this for hours. It's a passion topic for me. Well, there's one thing in particular that you need to watch out for. So love and hate are very close to each other in like the brain centers that control both of those experiences. And so, hate is not the opposite of love. It is sort of a other side of the coin of love. And when people are filled with a lot of rage or anger or desire for justice or retribution, it can turn into doing things legally with lawyers that not only destroy any chance of having a high quality, say, co-parenting relationship or friendship on the other side of this, but have many, many zeros on the end. And so to resist those impulses, to just let this lawyer start racking up bills and taking all kinds of aggressive actions, and instead be thinking about, what do I want this to look like in 10 years? Like, especially if you have kids, because that will help you sort of reconnect with this better higher self part and kind of rise above this firestorm of thoughts and feelings and emotions that may lead you to make decisions in the present that will lead to regrettable outcomes in the future.
Yeah. So my
Yeah.
audience loves the neuroscience. So you can nerd
Oh,
out on that all day if
good.
you want.
Gonna
What's
hoist my nerd flag right now.
Please.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, me too. I love it so much. So what's going on, like what's going on in the brain when there's this kind of severance of an attachment that
Mhm.
would, I mean, I'm guessing something's affecting the prefrontal cortex if they're becoming more impulsive, not thinking as long term and whatnot. But
Mm.
can you help us understand a little bit of the biology behind it? What's going on that's causing this?
Oh my gosh. Well, I can do a deep dive. I love it that your audience is interested in this. Because honestly, I think it's so helpful to have like a intellectual framework to understand our inner experiences. Because if we don't have that, we have all these thoughts and feelings and things that just feel true. And this perspective, I think, helps people manage them a little bit better. So what Dr. Fisher was able to uncover with her work, and this happened from putting people in fMRI machines where it was actually able to measure what was going on in people's brains, the different regions of it. She was able to isolate the fact that their attachment bonds. Okay, backing up a little bit. Human beings are built to bond to one another. Attachment bonds. We are hardwired to do this. This is what keeps, mothers and infants and parents attached to each other. And really, like the survival of humanity depends on our ability to form these attachment bonds with each other because they are so primally important. These systems are operated actually in a deeper part of our brain than our human thinking brain. So this is our mammalian brain. So like the mid brain. So mammals do this. So, the way that mommy dogs take care of their puppies, it's like the same kinds of things. This is where this is coming from. And because these systems are so incredibly important, there are processes built into our brains that support that. So for example, when you fall in love with someone, meet someone for the first time, and it feels very exciting, and there's attraction and nervousness, there's a dopamine kind of association that is very much in alignment with the kinds of stimulation that you will experience from something like stimulating drugs like cocaine or other stimulating things. Also, some of the experiences that people have through sexual addictions are like flooding and stimulating these dopamine centers. But what nature intended this to be is this fascination with this one other person that pulls you into contact with them. There's a sexual, physical component, there's a romantic component, and nature has designed this part of our brains to be really strong and active for about 3 or 4 years, just about long enough to get pregnant and raise a little baby into a somewhat self-sufficient 3 or 4-year-old. So there's that. But over time, there's another system that's operating, which is even deeper. And this is related to an attachment bond. So when you think about like romantic love being this glimmerance, this exciting thing that is really, unsustainable at the same levels in an early stage relationship, it over time softens into this much deeper and more powerful attachment bond that is actually recruiting opiate receptors, those systems. And so the reason why addictive drugs are addictive, like why people get addicted to cocaine or opiates, is because those drugs are artificially stimulating these brain centers that nature designed for the purpose of falling in love and staying in love with other people. So people develop attachments to substances, but also with sex addiction, porn addiction. It's like, there's the same systems that are built for connecting with other people and forming relationships, but it is more powerful, because of, especially with online pornography and just like the visual stimulation of it. But it's also like people not really realizing how love evolves over time. So they start chasing this dragon. They want to feel how they felt. So I know we're veering off a little bit from that, original thing, but that's what's going on. And so particularly in long-term relationships where there's been a very powerful attachment bond that has developed, so akin to that opiate type experience, people don't really realize the strength and the power of that bond. It's almost like a maintenance dose. There's just kind of like a comfort, a familiarity, a warmth until it's broken. And then they go bananas. Basically, they go into withdrawal and they don't understand what's happening.
Yeah, well, I think it's
Mm-hmm.
helpful. It's just good information for someone to be aware
Yeah.
of what their brain's going through, some of those impulses and desires, that
Yeah.
why they're there. You mentioned, the value of having someone like you who can explain what's going on.
Hmm.
Here's what's happening. Obviously, talk them through it. I think of, I've seen some people go through divorce, and I would say some have done it better than others. One thing I've observed is there's always a communal element when people handle it well. Like they're talking
Yeah.
with other people. Maybe they're starting to volunteer more. They're plugging in. Like they're giving themselves, like, I guess, new ways to experience those kinds of senses of belonging and
Yeah.
connection. Are there other things like that that people should be doing to make sure that divorce doesn't destroy them and that they can actually, get their lives back on track?
Yes, absolutely. And so I think what you're talking about, so the way that I conceptualize this process is, again, people going through stages, and there are internal stages of healing and doing the work. And in my experience, it can be difficult sometimes for people to sort of turn outwards again and engage in the world in new ways. And, like, what do I want this new chapter of my life to be about, until they have done the earlier stages of that healing work, because they're still unresolved on the inside. And I could not agree with you more that, especially as people are coming to the later stages of this process, to be thinking anew about, who am I? What is important to me? What do I need and want in my life? How do I build that around me? And developing a positive community can be very much part of that, because one of the hardest things for most people in a divorce is the loss of the community that was built through the marriage, right? You were doing things with other couples or families, and oftentimes the female partner was the social director, right? I mean, like, making plans with other people. And especially for men, they can become quite lonely on the other side of it. And so it's very important to have places to create new relationships, or restore relationships. And so, yes, you're absolutely right.
Are there
Hmm.
specific, so you're referencing stages. Is there like specific stages that someone goes, is it like the 5 stages of grieving, that same kind of idea where,
Before, in my experience, before people can really move on into what we were just talking about a second ago, the headspace where you can rebuild your life in an effective way, there needs to be some processing and some grappling with the dark emotions that are often related to a divorce. And so these can be things like feelings of shame, guilt, regret, anger, fear, jealousy, pain. These are legitimate feelings that will always come up. And there's so much value in connecting with these, and really leaning into them, because it's from these dark emotions that we have the opportunity to connect with what's most important to us, our value system, what we want, what we're afraid of. And then we can use that information for the next stage of this process, which is really around growth and learning, which is difficult to do, honestly, when we're super activated by all kinds of feelings. It actually takes a lot of pre work, oftentimes, for people to be able to dig in and answer questions like, what just happened? Like, and what was my role in that, in a non shame based way, like in a constructive, reality based, what are some of my takeaways from this, but also, I think, a recognition of, if I had to do things over again, what would I want that to be like, and who's the kind of person that I want to grow into, so that I can get a better result the next time around, should I decide to try this again sometime, which is incredibly productive. It can go into emotional intelligence, or communication skills, or emotional self-regulation, or, I mean, like, so many different things, right? um, and then from that work, we can take everything that we've learned and done, and then translate that into, so now what? What are those next steps? And so we've successfully said goodbye and taken all the important lessons from the life experience of a divorce, and then turn our gaze forwards rather than backwards, to think about where we want to go from here, and then turning that into an action plan, which is why the world needs coaches.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's
Hmm.
helpful to know though. So there's kind of there's the withdrawal and all the onslaught of
Yeah.
challenges that initially come
Hmm.
up. And I think everybody wants to get to that last
Oh,
phase as
yeah.
quickly as possible, where I'm ready to hit the ground running, take on the
Right.
world. But it sounds to me like it's actually the middle point. It's the emotional
Mhm.
processing where the real work is done for somebody to actually heal and to grow. Because I think what you said makes sense. There's a lot of fears,
Mhm.
a lot of regrets, a lot of questions. Like this is the hardest part about, I
Yeah.
have to imagine, I don't know,
Right.
but this has to be the hardest part about divorce because you're really confronting the reality and working through emotions that do not function rationally and they don't always work the way we want them to
Right.
work. But I can see on the other side of it, if somebody's doing that, they're not just going to be ready to take on
Right.
the world and build a life. But I have to imagine that's going to prepare people better for
Exactly.
another relationship as well.
Exactly. So this is why they call it doing the work, and that it is the work. It requires intention and effort and energy. It doesn't move as fast as people like, but you are correct. When people want to leapfrog over all of this and just start dating again, they are very likely to replicate the same situation that they just got out of because they don't have the insight into what happened. And going back to your very first question, about divorce rates, what you will see is that in second marriages, third marriages, there is a much higher incidence of divorce. And this can be due in part to stressors that come from co parenting or having a blended family, which the struggle is real. But I think a significant part of that too is people who get into second or third relationships without having done the work required of them to create the kinds of outcomes that we're talking about right now. Yeah. So there are risks to not doing it that people often don't recognize, but it's hard. Yeah.
Is there anything different when someone has, let's say somebody lost their
Mm,
divorce, sorry, lost their marriage because of their own mistake? You know, the classic experience, obviously, in our coaching practice is the pornography
right.
addiction or something worse, you know, an affair or
Yeah.
something else.
Hmm.
Are there any nuances when you've done something that is clearly one of the main reasons? Obviously, it's never the only reason, at least usually, but any differences to this process or how somebody should recover if they are the ones that made the mistake?
Yes. With people who have not to sugarcoat it, really like been the perpetrators of destruction in a relationship, and on the other side, in the cold light of day, are really reckoning with that. There is a lot of powerful, deep work to do that is all of the above, all of the different stages, but additionally, in that dark emotions phase, it's going to last longer, it's going to go deeper, and there must be a component of forgiveness, of redemption, a feeling of I am no longer the same person that I was when I did all of those things. And that requires a lot of deep growth. And people need a way of achieving that sense of forgiveness and redemption. And I believe that that is why literally all of the world religions have that process built into them because it's so fundamentally important. Hmm.
So I wanted to ask you
Yeah.
this. This is a perfect segue. Are there indicators if someone comes to you, you know, and
Hmm.
they have a divorce history? I have to imagine one of the $1 million questions someone's asking is, how do I know if I'm ready for another
Yeah.
relationship? And I'm wondering, are there any indicators to you when you're speaking with someone, or maybe you've worked with that client from the moment of divorce and they've gone through this journey? What are the things that tell you, okay, I think this person would be ready to get into another relationship again and be, I guess, maybe at a reduced risk of
Mm.
repeating. Again, I don't know exactly what you could hope for
Yeah.
that's realistic, but what are some signs that somebody is
Yeah.
ready?
Yeah. Well, that question number one for me is, have you done the work? And what that looks like. So, somebody who has done the work will have a lot of clarity, and they won't be running from something, they will be running towards something. So, the clarity piece that I would look for, someone who has done the work, will be able to tell me a story of their process that makes sense and is really in alignment with these stages that I've talked about. They have done the work of grieving, they have been able to work through those dark emotions and find the value in them They will have thought through, what did I learn from this experience? And what does this teach me about myself and who I am and what I want and what kind of person I need to grow into? And then they have done the work of becoming that new person. So for something like a sex or porn addiction is like, here's what was going on with me during the time that I was doing that. And here's what has changed within me and also in how I operate in the world that is telling me I'm actually a different person than the person that I was at that point. They have also, they're not experiencing a lot of big, dark emotions at this time. There's a relative sense of peace. So, people who are not ready to start dating again are trying to get away from stuff. They are wanting to find that new zing, that new person, that new like, well, if I was with the right person, that those things would never happen. There's like some magical thinking involved. So, somebody who's doing that as kind of an effort to get away from the work it's not going to end well. And so those are the things that I listen for versus somebody who has done the work and has done also the work of thinking about who am I now? What do I want? How am I going to create it? And they are ready to start actively moving towards the life and relationship that they want. And they feel a sense of competence too, I think, in how to create that. Now, I will say that it is often not until people get into a new relationship or they start dating again, the early stage relationships, that they have a lot of opportunity to begin practicing the things that they may have been learning about or wanting to develop in themselves until they, are with a new partner and they're like, oh, yes, here's my chance to communicate differently or whatever it is. So there is growth that does continue to happen at that stage. But yeah, those are the things I think about. Yeah.
Yep, it makes a lot of sense, and it does sound like that. There's an emotional maturity piece that I
Yeah.
think comes. It actually reminds me similar to the recovery process. If someone was to ask me, "Hey, how do I know if I'm actually free?" Because I've gone a year before without watching pornography, but I
Mm-hmm.
relapsed. How do I know this is different? Very similar, like we're looking for a change in identity. Are they still running from it, or is there that confidence that they're a new person that's going to carry them through the hard moments?
Mm-hmm.
Like lots of overlap there. I really like that. Um, I can't help but wonder, Dr. Lisa, because you're managing people with some big
Mm-hmm.
situations, big
Yeah.
emotions. You and I both know the nature of this work is it's a lot. What are you doing to take care of yourself when you are practicing this way? Because I think self care is very underrated, and I think a
Yeah.
lot of people are talking about self care now. But I still don't always feel like the messages have a lot of substance on here's how you actually,
Mm-hmm.
protect yourself and set yourself up for longevity. How are you managing all
Yeah.
the intensity of your
I
work?
love that. Well, this is good, and I think applies not just to us, to the helping professions, but to everybody who's in intense situations. And what I have learned over the years, and I did not always practice this, and I suffered as a result of not practicing it, but that they're really the two pillars, and one is very physical around. And for me, how am I caring for myself physically, which is exercise, nutrition. Taking care of that, like the hardware. I don't know if you've heard that phrase. We have the hardware, which is our physical bodies, and then we have the software, which is our mind and our emotions. And so I neglected the hardware for way too many years, but now it feels like just an indispensably important part of my life is how am I taking care of myself physically, to have the energy and the stamina to like be in a good place. And also, physical health has such a powerful relationship to the way our minds work and our brains literally function. That if new research actually over the last couple of years that even a lot of psychiatric disorders can be linked back to physical health and even metabolic disorders, which is fascinating. I'm excited for that research to continue to unfold. But the other piece of this for me, and I think for most people, is related to mindset and how we are actually shifting our thoughts and our perspectives in intentional ways to help ourselves feel better. Because, you can take all the bubble baths in the world, or you can go get a massage and still be ruminating about very triggering, stressful, things that will make you feel anxious or badly. And so it's that mindset shift that is most important. And when it comes to my work, particularly with people who are going through hard things, the most powerful mindset for me is my relationship and my understanding of dark emotions or challenging life experiences. I do not experience either of those things as being bad or negative or uh, I view them as being a necessary and constructive and really valuable part of someone's growth. So when someone is in the depths of despair, I look at this as a real opportunity for them. And I feel a lot of gratitude that they've connected with me and that I have the opportunity to kind of walk into that fire and help them come back out of it, because it's going to transform their lives if they do this. So I view it very positively when someone is angry or grieving or sad. It's, what are we going to do with this? So does not feel hard for me in the same way anymore. There are certain kinds of traumas that are still difficult for me that well, there is such a thing as vicarious trauma, essentially, where particularly therapists will basically take on board somebody else's traumatic life experience and begin to have symptoms of PTSD themselves as a result.
Wow. So you've experienced that?
Oh, yeah. I think that many therapists have particularly high empath therapists and counselors, people who are very empathic and who can really see things through someone else's eyes. Visual thinkers are very vulnerable to this. I also do another podcast. So I'm a counselor educator. I'm a supervisor of developing therapists who are working towards licensure. And one of my missions and things that I'm very excited about is how to develop and help and support therapists in their own love, happiness, and success. So I have love, happiness, and success for therapists, where we're talking about professional development for clinicians, because they're the people who are helping, countless others over the course of their careers. And unfortunately, many of them wind up leaving the profession if they don't have enough support, because it can be so difficult mentally and emotionally to be a therapist without some guidance and help along the way. So I have love, happiness, and success for therapists. And we did a whole episode recently on vicarious trauma, because it is an occupational hazard. And so I tend to be a very empathic person, which makes me good at helping people with relationships and understanding like how they're experiencing others. And that's really my strong suit. And I'm okay with some kinds of trauma, like combat, natural disasters, even domestic violence. But some of the things that happen to kids, it stays with me. So yeah.
And it stays with you. Is that, and that's because you're saying like there's just a sensitivity, which is obviously your strength, but something you have to be careful of, or does it play into your own experiences? Like,
Oh,
what does it look like?
well, I think my own experience is probably in the fact that I'm a parent. So thankfully, I am a very, very privileged person on a number of different domains. But one of them is the fact that I have been so fortunate as to not have experienced a really super major capital T trauma in my life. And that is a hidden privilege that I think we should all be more aware of, and how rare it is. I think it's not true for many others, but no, I think as being a mom and really like kind of, as an empath, essentially being in the room mentally and emotionally when people are describing the things that have happened to them in their past, it's traumatizing for me personally. So
Yeah,
yeah.
that is really tough. So I'm curious then, because given the nature of you, like
Mhm.
I can just tell you're such a compassionate, caring person. You want to help people.
Mhm.
Is that hard? Like, was that a hard thing to identify? Like, if people are going to go in this direction, I can't take
Um,
on the conversation or that sort of thing.
Well, and no, and I can and I will take on the conversation if people, if that shows up and we need to do that, I'm down. I'm not going to abandon somebody because of my, oh no, I mean, for somebody to have lived through that and to me not be able to muster up the strength to be able to help them, that would be no. But I think that every therapist, as they figure out their professional trajectory, needs to consider what are my strengths and where can I do the most good. And when I went to counseling school, that evolved for me. I was thinking, well, maybe I'll work with children, and then recognizing that it is impossible to help a child if they are in the context of a dysfunctional family system. And also that it is very difficult to help adults who have been raised in an environment of persistent, complex trauma, mentally, emotionally, and physically. And so, what I decided is where I could be the most value and service is how do I help couples and families strengthen and operate with love and respect and have healthy relationships that become the crucible in which children are brought into, and to have a strong, healthy family that supports the healthy development of a child. That kid is going to have a lot of privilege and be able to do a lot of good in the world, and be a fundamentally healthy person. So that's why I kind of operate in the upstream parts of this process. So that's where I go. Mm-hmm.
But that's a beautiful
Yeah.
thing. I've gone through this process myself
Yeah.
as our practice has grown, just realizing just the things that I enjoy the most, where I feel like, God has blessed me
Mm-hmm.
to help people the most, where I'm the most gifted. It's actually really liberating, and it's helpful just to know, like, if I focus on these areas, I'm going to be the most
Yeah.
impactful, and I like what you said, like knowing where it is in the stream, so to speak, upstream,
Right.
downstream, midstream, whatever it
Mm-hmm.
might be. I want to ask one more thing about this, and then
Yeah.
I think we should talk a little bit about just how to prevent divorce.
Yeah.
I think that'd be a
Yes.
really good place to land.
Definitely.
Do you ever feel a pressure to practice what you preach? And I ask this not just because of you're training other
Mm-hmm.
clinicians, you've done tons of education yourself, but then you're also a content creator, and so your messages are online. You have a great podcast, you have an Instagram page where you're helping a lot of people. I used to be a pastor, and I know this was a huge
Oh,
part
that's
of
awesome.
my journey as a pastor. Yeah, but part of the challenge was you're kind of just aware that as soon as you're in that role, people assume that you have your stuff together to a certain extent, and arguably you should, maybe to a certain extent, but no one's perfect. Everyone's working on their stuff, and I've friended lots of clinicians over the years, psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, and whatnot. And I can sense that sometimes in my conversations that there's almost this guilt when they are going through challenges in their own life, that I shouldn't struggle with this. I'm the marriage and family therapist. So how could I have dysfunction or discord in my own marriage? And trying to reconcile that. Have you ever dealt with that before?
Oh, of course. I mean, I'm human, and I know it's so much easier to talk about what to do than it is to actually live it, right? Um,
True. Yeah.
and I think also, have you ever taken the Enneagram personality? What
Yes.
what number are you?
Yeah. I'm a flaming
Oh my
three.
gosh, me too. And well,
Yeah.
and this,
Oh,
yeah,
nice.
threes. I know it's like being chased by wolves, but whatever. But I think an important, and I mean, I've had a doctorate in psychological assessments and like all the real deal stuff. But in my practice, there's so much value, I think, in the Enneagram. It is so spot on and helpful. And so, to answer your question, for me and my personality, as you all know, part of being an Enneagram 3 is being on that path of like personal development and figuring out how to walk the talk and be a really, I think, trustworthy guide. And so there are always so many times in my life where, maybe I have things that I need to do or figure out. But I feel like my desire to be a trustworthy, responsible partner for clients and for other people who trust me, it gives me motivation to do my own work in a way that I think really benefits me. And not that I do everything perfectly, but I think also, the times when I don't do things perfectly are like that. I could have done better there. I think also gives me a lot of empathy for how real this growth process is, and the fact that none of us just go like in a straight line. You don't flip a switch and achieve perfection. It's that the growth mindset and really having to work at things over the long haul. And the idea that that is how we learn is when we observe ourselves, maybe not operating in the best way that we could. So I think a self-compassion has come from that. And I think, yeah, but
And it does make sense. You're married. Your
mhm,
your marriage is going to go through the different rhythms that a marriage goes through, and that's actually great
yeah.
ammunition, if you will, to help your own clients, who are going through probably similar
Yeah.
things in a lot of different ways. So I like that. I also, a couple of minutes ago,
Mhm,
you talked about the value of fitness and
yeah.
health. And I know that for me, that's something I've really been digging into myself just
Good.
the last year or
Nice.
so, and feeling the difference of just lifting weights. And even earlier this week, I was at like a athletic performance center. I'm like trying to get some numbers because I'm doing some pretty intense work with a personal trainer, and I want to see how they
Ooh,
change. And
that's
they're
so
asking me, they're like,
Enneagram 3.
yeah, I know, right? I know. Like I said, flaming, not just a three,
All
flaming.
right.
Um, and so they were like, oh, so what do you do for, what do you do? Because typically people who walk in these places are athletes.
Right.
So I just told them, oh, I'm a business owner, but I'm kind of a high performer, and I'm just into my health and that kind of thing. And you could tell they were kind of like, they respected it, but they weren't used to seeing it.
Right.
But I really do want to
Yeah.
echo again. People don't have to be that intense. You don't have to be level 3 intense about it.
We need the
But I
gold
do think
stars.
yeah, I know, right? I know. But I do think I can't echo that enough. I think whether you are a practitioner or not, that physical health
Yeah,
component is super important.
absolutely.
Let's talk about a healthy marriage,
Yeah.
a divorce-proof marriage.
Hmm.
So to people who are either maybe getting ready to marry again or want to marry again one day after divorce, somebody who's single wants to be married one day and hopefully never divorce, or somebody who is married, regardless of your circumstance, what are the qualities of a divorce-proof marriage?
Oh my goodness. This is a big subject with many different facets. If we had to synthesize this into a few things, I think the number one piece would be having a relationship that is based on intentionality. So thinking about what you're doing and what you want and how you're going to get there, personal responsibility. What's it like to live with me? What am I like as a partner? Like,
Yeah,
right?
that right there. What's it like to live
What's
with
it?
me? That's a good
Well,
one.
it's hard because I mean, people are very like, my partner does XYZ, but not really recognizing that relationships are systems. So it's not just, two people. It is a relationship system where people impact each other. And so having perspective into that, I think, is very important. But also, again, going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, a very proactive mindset around what do we need to be doing sooner rather than later so that we can have the best experience with each other. And unfortunately, none of us are taught how to have good relationships. We learn that in our families of origin, which is why I became a marriage and family therapist. We sort of absorb it. And for better or for worse, I mean, most of us arrived into adulthood without having great models around how to communicate, how to show love and respect, how to be emotionally safe people, um, communication, emotional intelligence. I mean, there are so many things. And so I think everybody who has an authentically great relationship, and not just not get divorced, because there are a lot of people who are not divorced and who are also not having a good time, right? Even though they're still married. But I really think that it requires the same level of effort as we put into everything else in our lives, like our physical health, our careers. I mean, we go to college, right? Like nobody does anything like that for relationships. And then they're surprised when they're like, oh, this isn't going that well. And so I think to approach it as a part of life that we need to develop ourselves to grow into the kinds of people that can have really high quality relationships. And so in my experience, one of the most important pieces of this is emotional intelligence and also communication skills. So if people really dig into developing themselves on those two different domains, they're going to do real well. Yeah.
Emotional
Mm-hmm.
intelligence, communication skills.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Tell me more. Anything like emotion, because emotional intelligence is like this. Obviously, it's this burgeoning field now.
Sure.
Everybody's talking about
Mm-hmm.
it. Any facets in particular, especially you're talking to a lot of men.
Yeah.
What if a man wants to grow in emotional intelligence for the sake of his marriage? Where should
Oh
he
my goodness. Well, the
focus?
good news is that emotional intelligence is very coachable. It is like, here's what to do, right? So that I think is positive. But also, though, can I just say that many men, and not all, but many men in our culture did not get their needs met, their developmental needs met in order to develop strong emotional intelligence skills earlier in life. I think as just a function of their socialization, because Emotional intelligence, we think of it as being like just a good talker, right? Or being like good with people, whatever that means. But emotional intelligence is actually much deeper. There are four components. The first being self awareness, like understanding how you feel. I feel angry right now. I feel stressed. I feel sad. I feel nervous, whatever it is. Many men, because they were kind of disconnected from their feelings early in life, cannot even name their own emotions in a meaningful way. So self awareness and then self management. I know how I feel. What do I need to do to get myself back into a good place? Is the second pillar of emotional intelligence. And then the third is the ability to recognize what's going on inside of other people, other awareness, psychological mindedness. I know how you feel and I understand why you feel this way. And so, because men are oftentimes disconnected from themselves early in life, they have a level of mind blindness where it's difficult for them to really understand the hearts and minds of others, not because they don't have the capacity to do so. They absolutely do. It's just because it's like exactly a muscle that hasn't been developed. And then lastly then would be other management, which is knowing how to respond or show up or what to do in order to maintain healthy relationships. And then that's where those communication skills and behaviors come in. So the emotional intelligence is sort of the foundation, and then it turns into the communication skills piece on top of that. But it's difficult to communicate effectively if you don't know how you feel, can't regulate your own self, and you don't know how other people feel. Like, it's, you kind of have to do that work first. And there are different programs. So working with an emotional intelligence coach. So at my practice, Growing Self, I mean, that's one of the things that we specialize in. And this will come out later in the fall, but I am working on an emotional intelligence training series for people to develop competencies in this area, because it's so fundamentally important for relationships, but even for career. I mean, there's a lot of research looking at career outcomes. Um, where emotional intelligence is like the key variable and how that goes for people. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I have observed is the leaders I've respected the
Yeah.
most, or even my peers that I've seen ascend in their careers, they're all very emotionally
Yes.
intelligent. Like it is like a secret
Mm-hmm.
weapon. I love the way you just broke that down. I feel like the whole interview was worth it just for that. The emotional intelligence breakdown, the communication piece.
Yeah.
For a guy who's having a really hard time, so maybe he's building this understanding. Some guys we find are actually hyper aware of what they feel, but they were never taught how to process
Mm-hmm.
it. So they end up, doing the socially acceptable things that are not actually that productive. So for somebody who maybe is learning the communication part, so they built that awareness, they're starting to develop some empathy
Mm-hmm.
and the ability to insert themselves in someone else's shoes and really connect with them that way. What are some of the keys to really effective communication and
Mm-hmm.
taking this thing to the next level?
So many wonderful questions. Well, here too is communication is based on a number of different factors or pillars that all sort of work together. And so, for example, the very first and foremost thing is to have clarity around what kind of relationship you want, believe it or not. Because we need to tie what we do to the outcomes that we want to have. And so to think about, what do I want my relationship to look like, feel like, be like, is actually one of the starting points for effective communication. So to support people's development in this, because this is fundamentally important, I actually created a free, totally free 2-part communication training that anybody can access that teaches about these 6 pillars and goes into this systemic piece, which is, and this is oftentimes the most important thing for people to recognize, the negative dynamics that can start to happen between two people when communication is difficult, related to a pursue withdrawal communication dynamic. So, for example, in relationship systems, when it's not going well, there tends to be a polarization of what happens between two people. One person wants to communicate, connect, solve problems, and will tend to pursue that conversation in a way that sometimes can feel emotionally unsafe for their partner, not really recognizing what they're doing, but that leads the other person to withdraw mentally mentally, emotionally become defensive, become avoidant, which then, of course, escalates the pursuing partner to become more aggressive. And many times, though not always, men can fall into this withdrawn polarity where they are being defensive, avoidant, refusing to talk about things, minimizing their partner's experience, not wanting to engage. And so oftentimes for people, that's step number one, is figuring out where are they in that dance and what do they need to do in order to show up differently to stop the madness, because that can turn into this very intense cycle where one person is becoming increasingly aggressive and the other is becoming increasingly avoidant, perhaps going out the door in like to other relationships as a way of like removing themselves from that situation. But here too is like what we were talking about in the beginning, especially with that like silent but deadly divorce pattern. It's typically the person who was the pursuer for a long period of time and who wasn't able to get through, wasn't able to connect, wasn't able to get responsiveness, that will finally give up and say, you know what, I'm done. And so when the pursuer gives up the fight, that's when you're in trouble. But so in this free two-part training, it goes into a lot of that and then discusses the other pillars that need to be developed. And internal work, honestly, like showing love and respect, emotional safety, seeking to understand. And then it's actually only the like, so what do I say part that comes at the end of a lot of that internal work. Because if you just try practicing the what to do's, it's like slapping on a band-aid that comes off, and then people feel very discouraged, like, well, I tried that, I used I statements and it didn't work, so it's hopeless. Not realizing that there's a lot of other stuff going on in the background in order for
I
that
love
to
that.
work.
So
Yeah.
that's all in that
Mhm.
course you're saying?
Yeah, it's totally free. It's if anybody can take it. If you go to my website, it's growingself.com/communication. It's two essentially hour-long video-based training sessions with me, a big workbook with different exercises. You can do it alone if you just want to get some insight into your own part of the relational equation, or you can also take it with your partner if you'd like to do it with them. And it's really just designed to get some traction in the most important part of a relationship for many people, which is being able to communicate in a constructive way. Because when you can do that, all problems can be solved. But if you can't, little things will derail you.
Even the pursuer withdrawer thing is
Mm-hmm.
really helpful though, because my wife and I have like we just had our first son, our first
Oh,
child.
congrats.
I can't even say just anymore. I guess he's 10 months now. So a little while ago,
Yeah.
the first 6 months were really difficult on the marriage. We really felt the
Yeah.
difference.
Oh, yeah.
And definitely, she's definitely the pursuer. I'm definitely the withdrawer.
Mm-hmm.
And the last 4 or 5 weeks have felt really amazing.
Good.
And you just gave some language of what I was, because we were trying to learn. Like we talk every week about the marriage, and we're always trying to learn. Okay, why was this week so good?
Right.
Like what's going on? And that is something I have been doing, is fighting some of my withdrawing tendencies and just
Mm-hmm.
making a statement or apologizing early or
Nice.
initiating the conversation. And I know it makes a world of difference for her. But now I got some language to explain what's going on. So that was really helpful.
Yeah. Well, if you want to dig into that further, these are not my ideas. This is based on the work of Dr. Susan Johnson, who was the founder of something called emotionally focused couples therapy, which is one of the most well-researched evidence-based forms of couples and family therapy, EFCT. And unfortunately, Dr. Johnson just passed away actually earlier this summer, but she's written a number of books. So training programs for counselors and therapists, but an excellent book for lay people called Hold Me Tight, that goes into this pursue, withdraw, dance and how it's really related to attachment needs. It's an excellent book. I often recommend it to my clients. And so you and your wife should read it. Let me know what you think.
Yeah, that's awesome. And we'll make a mention of that in the show notes. We'll put your course in there as
Definitely.
well. Dr. Lisa,
Wonderful.
thank you so much for your time today. This was fantastic.
This has been a pleasure. You asked the best questions and you are such a gracious host. Thank you.
Thanks so much.